This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, graduates, students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical method. Today's conversation is with Ra Malika Imhotep, who is assistant professor of Global African Diaspora Studies at Spelman College. The central focus of their research is an application of Black feminist political economy to literal and figurative representations of transgressive Black femininities in folk cultures, aesthetic traditions, and resistance histories throughout the global Black South. To that end, their forthcoming academic monograph explores these themes through the folkloric figure of the tar baby. They are also the author of the poetry collection Gossypiin from 2022, a co-convenor of the Church of Black Feminist Thought, and a member of the Black Aesthetic Curatorial Collective. Their writing has been featured in the Guggenheim Museum, the Academy of American Poets, Women in Performance, the Drama Review, Palimpsest, and several anthologies. In this conversation, we discuss the complexity of intellectual work and cultural life, gender and Blackness, and the diasporic context, and the place of creative work in Black studies. Good morning, Ra. How are you today?
I'm well. I'm so happy to be here finally.
I'm so happy that you're here. I'm really excited to have you on the podcast for a lot of reasons. As we were talking before I hit record, you're joining a long list of Berkeley people on the faculty, but also graduates from the program. I will give a shout out to my sister, Catherine Summer Drabinski, who is a graduate of the rhetoric program at Berkeley. So she's always excited to hear people from Berkeley on the podcast. But it's a fantastic program. So many interesting people have come through there and are there. So in addition to your work, which I think is really interesting, I want to hear you talk about your work, hear you talk about Black studies and the relationship between those. But really for Ashley and me, we've really wanted to emphasize and really put a sort of underline on people who have PhDs in the field, and you have a PhD in the field. And I just think that makes a difference in terms of the texture and contour of an understanding of Black studies. So really excited for many reasons to have you on the podcast. So that's a long way of saying welcome.
I am, like I said, I'm thrilled. I'm like an avid listener. As said to you earlier, I'm always like listening, like, ooh, how would I respond to that? What's my story? And it's really generative to think about all the different paths that define one's Black studies journey. So I appreciate all the folks y'all have brought into my orbit, all the time y'all have spent with Berkeley folks, because now I get to like hear people I overlapped with or people who left before me or people who came after me reflect on their work. It's just been really rich. So thank you.
I appreciate that. It's a lot of work, but it's something that Ashley and I really love and are really committed to. And it's uncompensated labor, but people saying that they listen and that they really learn and think and enjoy, that's plenty of compensation for us. And so I appreciate you saying that. And you said you always wondered what you were going to say. Now you get to say. And so, we'll have a chance, of course, to talk about your work and how you understand the field of Black studies and that relationship. But I wanted to start with the more personal question and ask you, what is it that drew you to Black studies? What is it that drew you to the study of Black life? And what keeps you connected to and sustains you in this work?
Yeah, thank you so much. So I like to consider myself queer progeny of Black power, or queer progeny of Black cultural nationalism, more specifically. And some of that makes itself most clear in my name, right? Like I was given the name by my parents, Malika Imhotep. My father, abandoned his slave name in the 60s, went from Jerry Davis of Houston County, Georgia to Akbar Imhotep. And his thing was, being in the nation, but not wanting to be another X or a Muhammad. And he was a mathematician at the time. One of the first Black men, I believe, to pursue an advanced degree in mathematics from both UGA and Georgia Tech in the early 70s. And that's something I wish I talked to him about. But yes, the late Akbar Imhotep named himself in the late 60s, early 70s. My mother, Diane Makeda Johnson, named herself in the late 70s, early 80s. And so my parents' lives were like culturally, politically, spiritually transformed by like earlier waves of Black consciousness. And then they came together and met in Atlanta, Georgia, in this little Afrocentric enclave of the West End, celebrating Kwanzaa. My dad was very instrumental in the proliferation of Kwanzaa in Atlanta and throughout Georgia. And complicated holiday. This is not an endorsement of the stuff, the drama with Milana Karenga, et cetera, but just to state plainly that I met what I now know to be the practice of Black study at a very early age. And when I entered grad school, it was fascinating to me because I knew Afrocentricity as like a cultural mode of being in the world and not a field of study. So people had this kind of like pejorative association with Afrocentric as an idea. And I was like, well, what are you talking about? Like, you talking about dashikis and natural hair in the West End Atlanta? And they weren't. So that was interesting. I also want to say, so I think I met my first, Black studies teachers per se in middle school. I went to a KIP charter school. Folks in education know about the KIP program. It was really intense, like charter formula on the west side of Atlanta. But the thing that was distinct about my KIP experience was that we had all these teachers that it's like they wanted to be teaching at a Black independent school, right? So we had a social studies professor who went by Brother Africa. That was Joseph Edelin. We had another social studies professor whose Yoruba name was Baba Ajisafe Adetutu. And they really wanted us to, as these little Black kids from, inner city West Atlanta, these neglected communities, to really have this profound sense of cultural pride. And I believe that Mr. Jones, which is Baba Ajishafe's grandmother or some elder in his family, was an anthropologist, and she came in her African garb and talked to us about the Ma'afa, the African slave trade, and that really set a spark in me that I could do this work for the rest of my life. And at the end of our 8th grade graduation, KIP schools they do end of year field trips, and so they got us all galvanized, and we did fundraising to take a trip to Ghana. So I had my first kind of heritage tourism experience as a 8th grader, going to Ghana, West Africa, traveling through the country, spending time in those Cape Coast slave dungeons, etc. And when we graduated, we had a little time capsule, and I put my red, black, and green flag in it. I was so
I love it.
deeply colored by my Afrocentric doesn't even feel like a big enough word, but the way that Black cultural nationalisms, the confluence of the kind of southern wing of the Black arts movement, and all the different, the West End of Atlanta is full of almost every different kind of Black conscious person you can be. We have multiple sects of Hebrew Israelites. We have Nation of Islam, but also other Black Muslim communities. We have, the vegan hippie adjacent, just literally every different kind of Black political orientation one could affiliate with is present in that neighborhood. And I definitely feel that shaped my experience and understanding of what, again, Black study was in its most expansive framework as, again, a life practice. And yeah, is this where I talk a bit more about my intellectual genealogy? Because I did Black studies in undergrad. I did Black studies through grad school. I got a I should say, so throughout my schooling, I was always very intensely pro-Black. And I went to this little hippie private school in Atlanta called Paideia, just ready to start shit, ready to flip tables and wear my afro and do all the organizing and confront all the middle classness of it all. And then from there, I got a scholarship to go to school in New England at this small, icy enclave in Waltham called Brandeis. And while I have a lot of complicated feelings about my undergraduate institution, one thing that I think is really beautiful is that during my time there, and, my memory may be hazy because it's the memory of a college freshman, but I feel like when we first got there, there was African and African American studies, and I was gonna major in it regardless because that's what I was, like, here to do. I was gonna be, like, a
Mhm.
Black cultural anthropologist. I was gonna travel and study Black people. But the department at that time was mostly, in my perception, like white women studying Africa, like aspiring Africanists. And then during my time there, maybe even that first year, we got this like cluster hire, and they've really transformed the program into the direction of like contemporary Black studies. We had the historian Chad Williams come in as chair. We had Towards my senior year, we got Jasmine Johnson, who's a Berkeley alum and ended up being my, like, senior advisor and really instrumental in my understanding of the intersections between Black feminism and performance and diaspora. We had Greg Childs, who was, like, studying hip hop. We had Deron Wallace, who was studying education. And so it was just this real boon, of a different kind of, like, Black intellectual life. And to be honest, they were all cool and hip and fly, and so that, like, made it seem even more real and attainable and
Mm, mhm.
attractive to pursue, an advanced degree in Black studies. And initially, I wanted to be more of a Africanist, and so I was planning to apply to schools in the UK, and Jasmine was kinda like, "You gotta apply to some schools stateside," and kinda helped me compose this list, and Berkeley was her alma mater, and I was like, "Well, if they produce this fabulous human, um, clearly they got a
Yeah.
lot to offer," and that ended up being the program that I got into, and it was a beautiful journey. And I think, I was listening to the episode of the podcast y'all did with another one of my Berkeley colleagues, Kevin Rigby, and I know that he, like, had this kinda geographic spread of Black studies, and it's interesting to me as someone who studied, um, like, in the South, in New England, and on the West Coast to think about all the different flavors and variations I've got to experience, but I think the most fruitful part of my trajectory has been really understanding, like, Black study as a life practice. My commitment to Black study is a commitment to, like, really truly loving Black people, which, surprise, surprise, not everybody who goes into the field goes out of that same impulse, something I discovered in grad school, and really just, like, I don't wanna say troubling the waters, but, there was a time early in my grad school time where I felt, like, anxiety about having this, like, profoundly Afrocentric name that carries this marker of this certain kind of stereotyped Black consciousness that's presumed to be regressive or presumed to be patriarchal, misogynistic, homophobic, etcetera, and, like, what does it mean for me as like, what I presume to be, a radical Black queer feminist scholar to be preceded by this name that people have all these feelings about. And I actually had a colleague early in my grad school time kinda say as much, like, "I seen your name and was wondering what kind of people they let in here," you know?
Mm.
So it's been, definitely a big piece of my journey to, like, kinda stand 10 toes into the, like, complicated textures of my origins and of my, like, deeply rooted, deeply felt connection in, I feel like Imma say Black study is a life practice 1,000 times, but I feel indebted to the ways that my parents allowed Black cultural consciousness to transform their lives, and the ways that they put that forth in crafting me, quite literally. My father, a storyteller, so very much imbued in the vernacular traditions of the South and of the African diaspora. My mother, a social entrepreneur, but also doll maker, seamstress, etc. And I just feel so much of their creativity, in the way that they lived their lives before me, in the way they raised me, in the way they named me, and I think that really is the bedrock that has carried me through all these different instantiations of schooling. And I think my own, understanding of myself as queer, as agender, as disabled, have kind of troubled the waters of whatever normative assumptions either my parents or those around who perceive me might have had about what it means to come from those origins.
Thank you for all of that. It's very interesting, and I also like there's a way that, as you narrated it, you can say that you were Black Studies pre-birth, not Black Studies from birth, but it's like
Yeah.
Black Studies pre-birth. Um, so it's not actually a contest, but I've always kind of liked the idea that there's a sort of quiet competition for who's the most Black Studies person on the Black Studies podcast. There is somebody whose whose father was a Black Studies professor, and I'm like, I don't know that anybody can beat that. I mean, that's kind of but but uh, but jokes aside, I really love the richness of how you're able to narrate this notion of Black study and Black studies, and how it both is and is not part of then your discovery of an academic practice and passion and connection. And by the way, Chad Williams on the podcast. So just whenever names pop up, I always like to mention that. And of course, going to Brandeis, no small legacy to inherit. Angela Davis, also Brandeis
Yes,
University.
Angela Davis, Hortense Spillers, Patricia Hill
Hortense Spillers.
Collins. Like, it's kinda eerie. I actually think it has something to do with the spirit of Phyllis Wheatley bringing people to New England. I haven't figured it out yet, but I'm trying to understand why people end up in Massachusetts writ large, but in Waltham in part.
That's okay. That's amazing. That needs to be a bit of like historical fiction for you to write. I don't know if you're that kind of writer, but I'm already telling you got to write that short story. I will read it
No.
and share it on all my social media. Um, so let me follow up then and say, or ask you, especially since, both as an undergraduate and graduate, you've been so invested in the field of Black studies. I want to ask you to talk a little bit about the portrait of Black studies that you work with. And I always ask this in the context of its founding, which had a tension built into it, which was the student demand what came out of the student demand for a place on campuses where Black life, Black intellectual tradition could be studied, right? Traditional disciplines hadn't done that. The demand was for Black studies. That would be the place to do that. And it has been. And I think in Black studies, we inherit that as a commitment to intellectual life and to an intellectual tradition, both narrow and hopefully expansive into the 21st century. But also that moment of the founding of Black studies, late 1960s, early 1970s, was a moment of the radicalization of Black liberation struggle that had really contested those boundaries between campuses and communities, between classrooms and political mobilization, books, ideas, political prescription. And I think we inherit that in terms of the commitment in the field to a certain kind of liberation politics. And sometimes that can have a tension, right, between a commitment to intellectual life and a commitment to a certain form of Black liberation struggle. And I say tension always because I don't think it's a contradiction, but it's a tension, in terms of the kind of commitments that I think the field asks for. And sort of couched in those terms, I'd like to hear you talk about what that portrait of Black studies is for you and how it orients you.
Yeah, I love this question. I love the the way you position it as like not an either or, but a tension. And when I think about my own, Black studies geography, I think about the different manifestations that Black student movement took in all these different locations. So in the late 1960s at Brandeis, there was the Ford Hall occupation. Hortense Spillers was actually a grad student on campus in that moment
Hmm.
and recounts the like epistemological rupture of seeing Black studies happen live, right? And I want to say that it was in that moment or as a result of that moment that her graduate work shifted from a more kind of traditional English project towards this study of like the Black sermon. So I think about that a lot. I think about what just being in the presence of that kind of shift
Mm-hmm.
does. You know, I've had the opportunity to meet several Brandeis alum who were there in that moment. And I'm just really grateful for their legacy. And it makes me think of how, you know, right when I'm gonna like date myself in the young way that always feels scary for me somehow. But I was in college during the like first wave of Black Lives Matter. So we were engaged in so much organizing as our department was becoming a more contemporary Black studies department. So for me, they were always connected. And it wasn't just like going to protests or staging die-ins or putting up posters and going to class. It was also doing art. It was doing productions. We had a whole like Black theater moment alongside our protest work, alongside our academic work. And then the fall after I graduated, they actually had a kind of repeat of the Ford Hall occupation where they occupied a building in response to the university's failure to move in progressive ways regarding Black students, Black life, and Black studies. So I think about those kind of loops, but also the like inescapable enmeshment of Black studies as protest, as performance, as intellectual priorities. And so I feel like my Brandeis experience encapsulated it that way. When I got to Berkeley on the West Coast, of course, I'm close to SFSU and I'm hearing more about that history. I'm learning more about what it meant for Black studies to develop at Berkeley, the work of Veve Clark, the kind of anchor ancestors in the Berkeley AFAM department of Veve Clark, June Jordan, and Barbara Christian. We also just lost an elder, also St. Clair Drake. I be forgetting the men. That's my bias. There were a lot of really lovely, significant men in the history of Berkeley FM, including my hometown connection, Robert Allen, literally from my same neighborhood. Okay. We also just lost an elder who was instrumental in those early days of AFM at Berkeley, Daphne Muse, who has this immense archive of correspondence with everybody, like Walter Rodney, Alice Walker, Toni Morrison, like just immense correspondence with everyone. And she taught an epistolary writing class during those first days of FM at Berkeley. So I think about, again, how it's never as simple as like we want to think it is. It wasn't just Black intellectual tradition and Black protests. Like there were all these like minor notes or quieter keys that made up the study of Black life in that moment. And then, you know, when I first got to Spelman, I was teaching a class um, called Discourses of Diaspora. It's kind of our one of our core classes that minors in African diaspora studies have to take. And I realized that it was kind of doing the work of an intro to Black studies class. So I went to look through the Spelman archives to find like, so what were students at Spelman doing in 1968, 1969? And they were advancing the same protests in the same time space as SFSU.
Amazing.
The AUC, like a consortium of students from all three campuses, which at that time was Atlanta University, Morehouse, Spelman, and Morris Brown. Again, can't forget our kindred. So all four campuses. And a lot that would be surprising to a lot of people, right? Because it's a Black college. What are they organizing for? But it was really illuminating to me because what they were asking for was like, you know, no cops on campus, the same things that people are still organizing for. They were asking for the right to wear African attire to campus events. And that actually is really illuminating to me because it helped me understand that the push for intellectual space for Black study wasn't about, you know, radicalizing the curriculum as much as it was about the students wanting what they cared about outside of the institution to be reflected inside of the institution, right? They didn't want to feel like they were wasting their time inside this institution having to alienate themselves from or disavow these things that were shaping Black life around them. So I was talking just now about how culturally rich the West End is, and I imagine the lives of these students who are literally in the same geography of this kind of like new Southern Black power, these like multicultural influences, people from the African continent, from the Caribbean, et cetera, and being told that they can't engage in any of that because that's not what we do here at this historically Black college down the road. And that still exists. There is this kind of forced separation between students in the community. But when I think about the origins of Black studies in the context of the AUC, it does allow me to think with, I guess I would say, a little bit more nuance about what the ask actually was. You know, it wasn't just that they wanted Black teachers, because they had a few of those. It wasn't just that they wanted to study Black history, because they were doing that because they're at HBCUs to some measure, right? But they didn't want to have to disavow themselves as they entered the space of higher education. They wanted to be able to mature culturally and politically and to have those new priorities reflected in their experience. So I really see it as like super fluid in terms of the different categories of labor that make Black studies: the political, the intellectual, the creative, the cultural. I don't see clear demarcations at all. And I think that if we're attuned to how we actually live our lives inside of Black studies, we can see those pieces that we've thought we had to disavow in order to fit the mold of the Black studies scholar, right? And I think in my journey, a big part of kind of coming into myself as a very ambivalent academic at this point had been allowing those pieces that I thought didn't fit into the mold of a Black studies scholar to sit with me at the table, to enter the classroom as a person from West Atlanta, raised in this kind of Afrocentric nexus, as queer, as disabled, et cetera. So I guess that's also just my advocacy for like broad strokes fluidity and intra and anti-disciplinarity. But I do think that the field is a really precious confluence of multiple modes of being in the world that value, like, I'm gonna say Black aliveness, and I'm not explicitly referencing Kevin Kwashi's work, but more just like the concept of what it means to like live a full life in a Black person. Like, I don't want to say Black body either. We've made so much of these terms now
Yeah, so
that it's
true.
a little tricky. But you feel me? Like, I feel like it's really about cultivating spaces for wholeness. I feel like it was always about attempting to cultivate a space for wholeness in the place we were. And if the place we were at that time was college, that's where we wanted to advocate for wholeness. But I don't think it was purely about radicalizing institutions. And I think that's kind of where we've, mistaken the map for the territory.
Thank you for that. There's so much that is really interesting in that. And there's just some, just noting this and more just like responding, because I really loved the way you talked through this. And when you said that, that what would it mean to start in terms of this tension between the political commitment and the commitment to intellectual life, what would it mean to think about how political moments shape, right? Black liberation political moments shape how one even understands what intellectual life is or how one practices their intellectual and classroom life. No one has quite said it that way on the podcast. I think people have said it in different ways, but I really love that's very precise in terms of like how intellectual life is shaped by things that aren't from some sort of Renaissance painting of the scholar, right, where you discover between your pen and your paper. So I love that you put it so precisely there, and then also gave a real richness to it talking about also the demand was that the things that people live off campus should not be separate from what we are living and talking about in the classroom. And that's so well put. I'm going to borrow a bunch of this in my classroom. So I will give you a footnote as I talk, I promise. Because I hear that so much from my students, when say I'm, I just think Angela Davis came up before. I teach a seminar on Angela Davis regularly, and her Blues Legacies and Black Feminism book is my favorite of hers and really the focus of the course. And there's so many students who are like, I never thought that like my grandmother or great grandmother's record collection would be like philosophy. And like the astonishment, not astonishment, but the pleasure in that of like, oh, here's how you think about it. Here's how that's more than just some person in my life's record collection I was fascinated with as a kid. Now it's like this whole world opens up, and I'm like, that's what Black Studies is. And now the way you put that, I was like, there you go. That's the phrasing I was looking for. So I turned it into John Drabinski on the podcast for a minute. I sometimes do this, but I thought you put that so well. And it's what I love about Black Studies classrooms is when that comes alive. Yeah.
Yeah, and I also just had the thought that, even when I think about Atlanta's West End, one facet of that experience for me was like 5 Black bookstores within a 2-mile radius, Black bookstores on MLK, Black bookstores in the Mall West End, Black bookstores at the Shrine of the Black Madonna just down Ralph David Abernathy. And so I also want to underscore that even what I may be considering the like kind of cultural aspects of this tradition were extremely well researched, right? So the students in the late 60s aren't just like, we want to do the cultural stuff. They're literally spending their free time reading, like, what's the name? Like J.A. Rogers, and like they're like doing all this work to educate themselves. And what I hear them saying as they advocate in the AUC is like, this shouldn't be secret. This should be the main thing we get to do with our time. This practice of Black study. Like, if we here and we paying y'all money anyway, we should be able to do that, because they're actually intimate with a tradition of Black study, um, alongside doing this more traditional intellectual labor in the academy. Because there's so many book study groups happening that make up Black cultural nationalism. It was such a literate feels like the wrong word, but education, political education, cultural education was such a big part of making Black life in that moment that it makes sense to me that they wanted to be able to do that in the classroom as well.
And I think that's such an important thing to always remember about these historical moments of whether it's cultural nationalism or like the Black Panther Party or, which have their own, as you sort of narrated very personally about people have certain presumptions about a name or something like that, but also the way they inherit it through photographs. And, I also regularly teach a class on the Black Panther, Black Power moment. And the students are always astonished when I share these pictures of Black Panthers sitting in the park reading. And they're like, wait, I thought they were about guns. I was like, no, this is kind of some book nerd stuff that's at the center of this. And like this idea that there's the bookish people and the militant people, there's not that moment. And like appreciating that is, it's not really appreciating that is like an important sensibility. It's like actually getting the world correct. Right?
Yes, correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Another piece of my lore is that I definitely set out to like complete the Black Panther reading list when I was in high school. I think I got to Soul on Ice and was like, this is a lot. But I set that as a project for myself. Definitely read The Wretched of the Earth, read Soul on Ice. I don't know where else I got on the list, but those are the two that stood out to me.
Totally unprompted, but since you bring it up, that list was first published in the Black Panther newspaper. The first time they printed that the famous list was October 26, 1968, which was also the day I was born. So
Oh.
I was like, okay, there's my destiny right there. It's like,
That's
how
funny.
do you figure out a set in motion white black studies professor? Well, why not? They had the list on the day I was born, not my birthday, the day I was born. Anyway. Well, let me shift a little bit and ask you about your scholarship. And in particular, I want to ask you how you think your scholarship fits in terms of the past and future of the field of Black studies. You know, you've talked a little bit about it, questions of gender and sexuality. I know you're interested in media studies and aesthetics, performance studies. And there's so many different aspects of Black life that can be opened up from this cluster of interests. And so I'd like to hear you talk about how you think your research and kind of work you're doing fits in the history of Black studies, right? How does it fit in the field? But also, what boundaries do you think it pushes, or what new horizons do you think it opens up?
Yeah, thank you for this. I'm like, where to begin? One of the things I really loved about my Berkeley experience was that not only was I in the Berkeley Black Studies department, and our PhD is officially African Diaspora Studies. We've definitely expanded, like the
Hmm.
department is
Hmm.
African American and African Diaspora Studies, but the PhD program itself is ADS. But now it's kind of held as Black Studies at Cal. But not only was I there and in that intellectual home, I was also in the Bay. Like I was in the East Bay, I was in Oakland, I was in Berkeley, I was in San Francisco on occasion. And I got to feel kind of what we've been talking about, just like the influence of the cultural surround and really allow that to feed my thinking as a creative intellectual. And it was supported, like the department supported so many of my ideas, my campaigns. Like I felt so, what's the word? The word held is coming up, but I think it's like kited. Like I felt like there was like air beneath me whenever I had these like impulses and ideas, and whether that air was from professors or colleagues. Like me and one of my dear colleagues from Berkeley got ourselves connected with this Black film collective called the Black Aesthetic for several years while we were in grad school, and that really put us in a Black arts community in Oakland. And I think that was something at the time that we both desperately wanted and needed and helped strengthen our work, right? I started a embodied spiritual political education project called the Church of Black Feminist Thought with a colleague in performance studies at Berkeley, Miyuki Baker. And that was this effort. I was supposed to be preparing for qualifying exams. And it's like, you know what I want to do? I want to create spaces for folks to sit and close read the work of Black feminists. That's what I want to do. And inevitably, that level of close attention and that practice of facilitation, community facing work strengthened my intellectual projects, et cetera. So my understanding of my scholarship is kind of rooted in these more communal or public facing platforms. It's also rooted in the creative. At the same year that I finished my dissertation, I published a poetry book called Gossypiin. And the work of that text is really to like tend to, Black femme interiority, histories around like reproductive violence and survival, ruminations on like femme identities outside of like normative understandings of womanhood. And all of that was necessary to the production of the quote unquote scholarly project, where I found myself doing work. Initially I had this like widespread multi-site ethnography plan because I was gonna, as I said early, travel and study Black people. Um, COVID happened, so I was not able to, do this cross-cultural analysis between Cuba, Ghana, and whatever. I really had to think about how to explore where I was. How can I explore the US South as a node in the African diaspora? And I'm not alone in that work. I think about the work of um, mm, Jarvis
McGinnis, yeah, on the
McInnes,
podcast.
also on the podcast.
Yeah, yeah.
I think about the work of Ahmad Hayes Green, or Green Hayes, forgive me, who are people who are studying the Black Atlantic through the lens of the South, and Alex Chapman, who's a scholar at Emory, who also studies the African diaspora through the lens of New Orleans. And so
Alex is scheduled to be on the podcast not long after you. So there you go, anticipating episodes. I love it.
I'm here. I really love being a part of that network because I think it's really generative to understand not only the circum-Atlantic world in terms of thinking about all the places basically that slave ships touch, but also to understand that like American empire is just another node in diaspora and not this wholly set apart thing that I feel like is sometimes the tendency within the field. So through that vantage point, studying the Black South, studying Black queer femininities in the Black South, but thinking about queerness and Black femininity in perhaps more expansive terms, thinking about um, how do I say everyone from like the twerk starlet Betty Butt, who performed twerk videos throughout the early 2000s, to the domestic worker turned folk artist, vernacular artist, painter Clementine Hunter, who worked on the Melrose Plantation in northern Louisiana for most of her life, and then became this like notorious painter as a figure of the domestic. Thinking about my own work as a Black feminist performance artist using the field of burlesque to do this kind of transgressive storytelling work. Like I've really been pursuing a question around how Black femininity mutates around presumptions about what it means to perform different variants of labor, whether that's creative labor, scholarly labor, domestic labor, etc. And when I narrate it, you know, I was once called a dilettante by a colleague, and
I'll defend the word dilettante. I love being around dilettantes. I mean, I have my own aspects. They're totally great people to have lunch with, have a drink with, whatever. Anyway, so don't shy away from the word, but go ahead and explain. Sorry.
Well, no, I understand myself to be an expansive thinker, and it brings me to this question of how I situate my work in relation to the past. I think a lot about Barbara Christian, first Black woman to be tenured at UC Berkeley. She was a literary critic, but most importantly, I want to say she was a Black woman writer, you know, Black feminist literature scholar, but a Black woman writer first and foremost. In her 1987 essay, The Race for Theory, she says, "What I write and how I write is done in order to save my own life." I mean that literally, you know? And I'm going to forget the last sentence, but it's basically like writing is how I know that what I think slash feel is, right? It's how I know I'm not hallucinating. And I like that is always my method statement. You know, I'm like, I can't really tell you I'm not going to give you what you want in terms of like the strict disciplinary explanation of why I made this choice or why I use this tool. And I've acquired it the more time I've spent in the field and the more people ask and I recognize they want a different kind of answer. But I really do feel that what I write and how I write is done in order to save my own life and to reconcile the kind of vulnerabilities I feel shape my experience of being in the world and the way that that sparks ingenuity, which I've sometimes called like dirty possibility. Like, how does having to mutate or shift forms to navigate violence, whether that's like gendered violence, interpersonal violence, the violences of ecological dispossession, like how does a proclivity for that kind of mutation shape one's orientation to aliveness, shape one's orientation to performance, shape one's orientation to sexuality? And those questions, see, I done strayed from my little notes, so I'm like, where am I? But pursuing those questions, and specifically in light of my father's passing, who, as I said earlier, was a storyteller, has led me to the figure of the Tar Baby, which is a folkloric character um, from the African diaspora, but popularized in the work of Joel Chandler Harris. And I could go on a whole thing about Joel Chandler Harris, which I won't right now. But in response to the murder of a young Black girl on a BART train in Oakland in around 2018, Nia Wilson, I sat in my room and set out to write a folktale. And I literally turned to this story that I had heard my father tell thousands of times of Brer Rabbit and the Tar Baby. And I reread it and I was like, oh, this is kind of dark. I don't remember it being this violent. But Brer Rabbit's encounter with this figure is marked by violence and indignation. He's like, how dare you not speak to me? And so on goes the story, and he gets all stuck up in it through literal physical aggression. And I set out to write that story from the Tar Baby's perspective and gave myself an invitation to imagine, the interiority of a figure who canonically has no voice, right? Ain't saying nothing is the repeated refrain in the folktale as it is originally transcribed. So in the current manifestation of my academic monograph, which is an outgrowth of my dissertation, I'm thinking about the figure of the Tar Baby or the Tar Baby principle as a way to understand this practice of um, mutation that marks what I call the figure of the Black trickster feminine, um, as people marked by Black femininity work to navigate all the violences that attend to our lives. And I'm particularly interested in how these mutations and how these trickster technologies show up to mess up what we think of when we presume relationships between Black femininity and labor, whether that's erotic, domestic, performance, etc. And I find that really deeply indebted to the work of Black feminist writers, artists, and scholars from the late 80s. And I find it connected to the contemporary work of people like Bettina Judd, who are really on the podcast,
Yes.
and theorizing from a place of vulnerability, and I've just started thinking about that word vulnerability in relation to my scholarly practice and pedagogy, but really taking seriously what it means to name outright that the writing, the intellectual production, the cultural production is an effort towards saving one's life, and like the vulnerability that that statement admits, right? Like I need to do this work to know that I'm not hallucinating. And of course, the Black madness studies in me. The Black madness in me is like, and what if I am hallucinating? Maybe that's where I'm supposed to be too. But yeah, that's my um I won't call it ambling, but that's my kind of errant course of my research in the way that I feel like it time travels between the past and future. Because it is my hope that the futures of Black studies can pick up the vulnerability of earlier waves of Black study, particularly Black feminist study, where they were really concerned about forging and protecting space for themselves. And tragically, many of those scholars did not survive. I would say died prematurely, especially when I think about Barbara Christian, Bebe Clark, June Jordan. Even Audre Lorde has a testimony to, being denied leave and being denied resources from institutions while battling or being in a dance with cancer. So it's I think that my scholarship in all of its manifestations, my creative intellectual production in all of its manifestations has been connected to questions about vulnerability and precarity, but equally invested in survival is not the right word, but yeah, life otherwise, I suppose, which is how I show up at the trickster's doorstep.
I love that. Thank you. It was really interesting to hear your reflection on your own work and all, but it was also such testimony to your to the meaning and the effect and affect of Black studies from the beginning, because I think there's so many ways to think about what Black studies makes possible. I mean, on the one hand, it's more laborious because you want to use a method from sociology. You got to really understand like something deep about sociology. You can't just interlope. Same with literary studies, whatever. There's also all the stuff we talked about culture and political commitment, but there's also the complex freedom that Black studies opens up, especially Black studies from the beginning, just hearing you talk. But that freedom is also its own kind of I don't want to call it terror, because that's a real like terrifying thing, but like real anxiety, when because I read when Barbara Christian says that, I teach that essay pretty regularly, and I always make the students sit with like, how many different ways can you hear that to save my life? That's somebody who's like, I might die, but it's also somebody who's like, look at me living, right? And everything in between. And, the way you narrated that, I was like, I can't imagine you getting there as an intellectual and as a writer and as a person with imagination without Black studies. I mean, it just seems so indebted to what Black studies makes possible, and where it can place us in those, as you said, vulnerable places of having to articulate something that hasn't quite been articulated. Yeah. All a long way of saying I really love that response and the way it really underscores so many important aspects of Black studies. And so I'm curious then, as one of the last two questions I have for you, thinking about the history and the future of the field, as you so concluded there, what do you think Black studies has traditionally done well, but also what do you think it has traditionally not done so well?
I think what Black studies has consistently done well is, shake the table, trouble the water, right? Like I was saying earlier, like Horton Spiller describes it as an epistemological rupture, right? A rupture in the way we know that we can think, right? A rupture in the way that we think knowledge. And I feel like continually from the days of I'm not going to embarrass myself by trying to reach for a long ago name, but from the days of Du Bois and Carter G. Woodson, there's been this consistent contesting of like the regime of knowledge production or the regime of cultural production, the regime of cultural propriety, right? What is allowed, what is endorsed. And I think that I feel that as a consistent thread in the field, even as Black studies continues to unsettle itself, right? Like all the debates we have now between things like Afro-pessimism and whatever people imagine to be its opposite in this day and age. And even there's different flavors of Black feminist work. I remember when I was early in grad school, like the pleasure ninjas was a thing. And then there was like conversation about, well, what does it mean? Is it really, have we arrived at the point where we can talk shamelessly about pleasure, or do we still have work to do? So I think there's always been a generative instability within the field that I think is something that the field has done well and kind of demonstrates that kind of freedom you were talking about just now. What I think the field has not done well is contend with the body. I've been thinking a lot about what it means, or what could it mean to make wellness a core tenet of the Black Studies Project. Like as I dream and manifest expanding a global Black Studies minor or program at Spelman, I'm wondering like what would it mean to say one of our core tenets is wellness. We shouldn't have to sacrifice our bodies, our mental well-being, etc., in pursuit of this work. And I know there's been kind of intellectual turns both towards and away from the body. I can remember hearing in grad school people being like, I'm so over the testimonial style of writing in Black studies and all of these things. But I really think, and Bettina's work was really illuminating for this in me. Like so much of our work in Black studies is produced through grief. And grief isn't just like an ideological experience, right? Like it is an experience that happens in the body, right? What does it mean to actually tend to that in the way that we do our work? I think about our elders. are we tending to them? Like, are we tending to them as we throw these symposiums and host these things? Like, what does it mean to not leave the body behind? I feel like is my, like, provocation for the field and a place where I see us fail. And I feel us fail because I feel how hard I have to work against those impulses.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And maybe that's already a response to this last question. I mean that the issue you just posed there is taking the human seriously in scholarship and scholarly gathering and life, which continues to be like provocative and radical. It's a little strange, but I think that's probably a millennia old at this point. that shortcoming. But I like that you raise it here and say, what does it mean to take that seriously as a Black Studies concern? So maybe it's kind of a response, but I'll ask this last question anyway, which is, what is the issue you would want us to all be thinking about, or the question you would want us to all be asking?
Yeah, so I think that, and I'm trying to get the words together, but there's such beautiful work coming out of the space of Black ecologies, and something that I've been thinking about is how might a turn towards ecological relation help us get out of this contest of importance between, like, the human and the socially dead, if that makes sense. Like, I've been thinking about what might thinking about Black life in relation to the earth do outside of that dichotomy of, like, undead or fearlessly alive, and maybe we aren't human, and those are places that I think are generative. But in this day and age, as we face mounting ecological crises throughout the world, right? I think another thing I would add to the what we don't well is, like, really take seriously the transnational right now. I think the origins of Black studies were very invested in the global and the transnational, and we've somehow gotten more provincial. Um,
Mm-hmm.
well, somehow, like neoliberalism, et cetera, et cetera. But I really think that I'm curious about what a turn towards Black life in relation to the earth, both in its beautiful ways in terms of healing, et cetera, but also in its ugly ways, like thinking about enslavement as a point of ecological relation to, like, just how what might that open up and what might that enable in terms of our, like, efforts at transnational solidarity and our work towards, interrupting some of the earth devastating practices that are happening throughout the world right now.
Thank you for that. The gravity of that question cannot be overstated, and I like that you leave us with that. This has been such an interesting and really deep and searching conversation. There's so much to think about, and because this was a really thoughtful contribution to the series. I appreciate you sharing, like, so many insights and reflections. This is a fantastic contribution to the series. We're lucky to have you on it. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much. It was truly a pleasure, and I don't know if I'll listen back because that's kind of weird, but I'm really grateful for this opportunity to think out loud with you, and I am excited for it to be shared with the world.
Well, it'll be something that when people listen, they will leave with a lot to think about. So I will say, on behalf of all those people, thank you so much. I appreciate that, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Take care.
All right, bye-bye.